These last few Sundays, we've been going through the Gospel of Mark, and we're going to pick up this morning at the end of Mark chapter 4. And we're going to look at a series of miracles that Jesus performs that are all grouped together in this section of Mark. 4 different miracle stories in total. And we kind of look at what ties them all together. In the end of Mark chapter 4, Jesus calms a storm that is threatening to capsize the boat that he and his disciples are in. In chapter 5, Jesus vanquishes a legion of demons. And then he goes on to heal a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years and ends with raising a girl who is 12 years old from the dead. The main theme that seems to tie all of these different miracle stories together, these different sections, is the vanquishing of hostile forces, things that are hostile to God and His plan for His people. Jesus fights against the elements, against the demons, against disease, and against death. And in each one of these, He proves Himself to be the supreme Lord of all, who has authority over all. Let's get right into the text this morning, beginning in Mark chapter 4, in verse 35. In Mark chapter 4, beginning in verse 35, it says, "On that day when evening came, He said to them, 'Let us go over to the other side.' Leaving the crowd, they took along with them in the boat, just as He was. They took Him along with them in the boat, just as He was, and other boats were with Him. And there arose a fierce gale of wind, and the waves were breaking over the boat so much that the boat was already filling up. Jesus Himself was in the stern, asleep on the cushion, and they woke Him and said to Him, 'Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?' He got up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, 'Hush, be still.' And the wind died down, and it became perfectly calm. And He said to them, 'Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith?' They became very much afraid, and said to one another, 'Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey Him?'" Moving from the scene that we saw at the beginning of chapter 4, where Jesus was teaching the crowds from the boat, now Jesus wants to take that boat to the other side of the sea with His disciples. And they leave the crowd, and they get in the boat, and they cross the sea. Verse 36 mentions the interesting detail that other boats were with them. We don't know if these boats had members of the crowd in it, or if these were just other boats containing His other disciples, perhaps. Maybe they didn't all fit into one boat. I don't know. But what happens while they're crossing the Sea of Galilee is that everything is suddenly stirred up by a fierce wind, and the waves start to break over the boat, and they start to take on water, and they are in danger of capsizing. And throughout all of this terrifying tempest, Jesus is asleep. And He is in a stern, sleeping on a cushion. This is the only instance in the Gospels where it is explicitly mentioned that Jesus is sleeping. And it's while He's in a boat in the middle of a storm. And 3 of the Gospels mention this story, that Jesus was asleep during the storm. It reminds us a little bit of Jonah, in Jonah chapter 1, where, although the circumstances are much different, Jonah was this reluctant, disobedient prophet, fleeing God's will, who had plenty of things to be afraid of. Whereas Jesus was a willing, obedient son, serving his Father's will, and he had nothing to fear from the storm because, well, He made the weather. He made the world. He made the sea. He made the clouds. He made all of these things, and He commands them, and they do as He wants. And the disciples wake Jesus up, and they say, "Oh, Master, Lord, don't you care that we're dying?" Like the sailors in distress, they cry to the Lord for help. And Jesus gets up, and He rebukes the wind and the sea like it's the most natural thing in the world. "Hush! Be still!" No? Like a parent telling their child, "Hush!" Except, well, in Jesus' case, that wasn't an implicit rebuke of my own children at all. And like in Jesus' case, His children actually listened to Him. In this case, the wind and the waves actually listened to Him. And more remarkable than the fact that Jesus is talking to the sea is the way that the sea actually listens to Him. The wind dies down and everything is calm. And He asks the disciples, "Why are you afraid? Do you still have no faith? After everything you've seen, is this miracle really a surprise to you? After all I've done? After the authority I've demonstrated? Why are you afraid?" Now, the point of miracle stories in the Gospels isn't to prove that Jesus is powerful. He's already proven that. But what is the extent to which he is powerful? What is the extent of his authority? How far does it reach? Now these stories are just as much about how people are responding to his miracles as they are about the fact that he's performing them. And in this case, the disciples, when Jesus asks, "Why are you afraid?" they immediately respond by becoming even more afraid. It's like the person's panicking. Stop panicking! Stop panicking! You shake them like that. Well, that's not going to really probably help the situation very much. Why are you afraid? And they become even more afraid. Why? Well, because who does that? Who can do that? Who can tell the wind and the waves to shut up and they do it? There's a lot of Old Testament passages about God controlling the weather, God summoning storms, God hurling fierce winds on the sea to stir up the waves. This is a very private miracle, by the way. And not a lot of people would have been witness to the fact that Jesus just got up and rebuked it. And if you were in any one of the other boats that are mentioned in verse 36, you might think, well, that was sudden. You might think, well, it's kind of like Florida weather. Here's storming one minute, and now it's perfectly bright and sunny the next. But if you were in the boat with the disciples where Jesus was, and you heard him say, "Hush, be still," and it responded to him, that changes your perspective on the weather considerably there. I mean, what would the Pharisees have said if they saw this miracle? Jesus just commands storms by the ruler of storms. Oh, wait a second. No, that doesn't work, does it? Command of the unstable sea and the storms is God's prerogative. The fact that Jesus does it is kind of hint. Maybe Jesus is God. A second story, in chapter 5, they came to the other side of the sea, into the country of the Gerasenes. When he got out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. And he had his dwelling among the tombs, and no one was able to bind him anymore, even with a chain, because he had often been bound with shackles and chains, and the chains had been torn apart by him, and the shackles broken in pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. Constantly, night and day, he was screaming among the tombs and in the mountains and gashing himself with stones. Seeing Jesus from a distance, he ran up and bowed down before him, and shouting with a loud voice, he said, "What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torment me." For he had been saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." He was asking him, "What is your name?" He said to him, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He began to implore him earnestly not to send them out of the country. And there was a large herd of swine feeding nearby on the mountain. The demons implored him, saying, "Send us into the swine, so that we may enter them." Jesus gave them permission, and coming out, the unclean spirits entered the swine, and the herd rushed down the steep bank into the sea, about 2,000 of them, and they were drowned in the sea. Their herdsmen ran away and reported it in the city and in the country. The people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and observed the man who had been demon-possessed sitting down, clothed and in his right mind. The very man who had the legion. And they became frightened. And those who had seen it described to them how it had happened to the demon-possessed man and all about the swine. And they began to implore him to leave their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed was imploring him that he might accompany him. And he did not let him. But he said to him, "Go home to your people. Report to them what great things the Lord has done for you, and how he has had mercy on you." And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis what great things Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. On crossing the sea, they arrive at the country of the Gerasenes. And they get out of the boat, and a man with an unclean spirit confronts them. Now, we've seen this kind of thing before. Casting out demons is pretty typical for Jesus. So, we shouldn't be surprised at how the story ends. But this man, he's a different kind of demon-possessed guy, because he has a lot of demons in him. And he has super strength. When this man's hanging out in the tombs, an unclean place for an unclean man with an unclean spirit, no one can bind him. They can't even keep chains on him. It's not just that they can't catch him to put chains on him. It's that they've actually tried chaining him up, and he's broken out of the chains and somehow broken them. The demon that this man has actually given him superpowers, supernatural strength. No one is strong enough to subdue this guy. Here is a strong man that cannot be bound. Jesus analogizes his casting out demons to he likens it to the binding of a strong man earlier in chapter 3 in verse 27. Well, Can Jesus bind this guy? This man, he spends his time, his day and nights among the tombs, in the mountains, screaming, gashing himself with stones, acting like a madman. One is reminded of the behavior of the prophets of Baal in 1 Kings chapter 18, where they called on Baal to hear them over and over and cut themselves. And this man who's engaging in all this crazy behavior comes up and bows before Jesus. Would it be a good thing if a crazy person came and bowed before you? What business do we have with each other, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? Similar to the protests of demons we've seen before in the synagogue at Capernaum in chapter 1 and verse 24. Do not torment me. The reason the demoniac was saying these things was because Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. But the demon didn't obey right away. Interesting. Instead, the demon begs. He tries to negotiate. And you know what I think is more remarkable than the fact that the demon tries to negotiate is the fact that Jesus lets him negotiate. The demon's name is Legion. Legion, why? Because we are many. Now, what was a legion? Well, a legion, in the Roman world, a legion consisted of 6,000 soldiers. Now, did the man literally have 6,000 demons, or was the demon name a purposeful exaggeration of its own numerosity? We don't really know the answer to that. We do know that they managed to possess 2,000 different pigs. Is that 3 demons to a pig? I don't know. The demon begs not to be sent out of the country. Why, look, there's a herd of swine on the mountains. We want to possess the swine. Send us there. The unclean spirit wants to go from inhabiting a man who lives in unclean tombs to inhabiting unclean pigs. And you know what's remarkable? Jesus allows this. The demons possess the swine, cause the herd of swine to rush down the mountain, drown themselves in the sea. And this is a really strange miracle when you think about it, because there's a lot of unanswered questions. The text does not tell us these things. Why do the demons get to negotiate with Jesus? Why does Jesus actually allow their concession? Why would Jesus do something that kills all these pigs and ruins the livelihood of the pig farmers? But those questions are not nearly as important as the real questions that the disciples should be asking as they witness this. Who is this that commands the unclean spirits? Who is this that the demons have to get permission from? Who is this that even a legion of demons are terrified of him and have to beg their way out of being banished? You read the story that way. Suddenly we have reason to fear who Jesus is. Jesus' actions here are not normal for someone who's a mere human. Jesus' conversation here is not normal for someone who is a mere human. There's something else to this too. Message of hope and comfort. Because, think about it. Is the world full of darkness, suffering, and corruption? Yeah, of course. But while the world may be full of darkness and suffering and corruption, it can't exist and it can't persist without God say so. And it might seem a little unfair from the human perspective, in our little limited temporal view of things. It might seem unfair from our perspective. But God sees the whole of evil forces as just a mere blip on the radar of eternity. He permits evil to act briefly in this temporal realm before He destroys it and brings His chosen ones to glory. And even Satan himself, rebellious against God's ultimate purpose, is incapable of crossing the boundaries that God sets for him. And even this army of demons, which could overpower any one of us, all of us, even they cannot act without the Lord lifting their barrier, without the Lord giving them permission. And the one who commands all of that, certainly He will also destroy them in the end. May God be praised for His power over evil. The locals don't see it this way, of course. The herdsmen of pigs see their pigs are gone. And they see what's happened. And they go and they tell the city and they go tell the country. And it draws a crowd, like Jesus' miracles have before. But it's a crowd that doesn't react quite like the other crowds that we've seen in the Gospel of Mark. They see the man who's been demon-possessed. They see him now sitting, clothed, in his right mind, unlike before when he was hiding in tombs and naked and acting crazy. And they know who he is. He's got a reputation. We've been trying to capture this guy. He was possessed by a legion. and now he's just being normal. And they become afraid. And you know what they start doing? Oh, Jesus, we want you to perform more miracles for us, right? Like all the other crowds? No, they want Jesus to leave. We want you to get out of here. We're scared of this. We're not ready for this. They start begging Jesus to leave the region. The word for begging here, or imploring, is usually used in the Gospels whenever people are begging Jesus to heal them or imploring Jesus to heal someone for them. The demons, of course, implored Jesus, don't send us into the swine. The locals implored Jesus to leave the region. The formerly demon-possessed man implores Jesus to let him come along. So they beg Jesus to leave the region, and Jesus obliges their request. He gets in the boat to leave. As he's leaving, this man, newly in his right mind, he wants to go with the man who saved him in the boat. And Jesus says, no. No, I want you to go tell the news about this in your own hometown. Go tell them what God has done for you. Go report the things the Lord has done for you. And the man goes and he tells everyone the things that Jesus did for him, recognizing implicitly that Jesus is Lord. He's been freed from the grip of Satan. He has no delusions and no reservations about who Jesus really is. It's unusual for Jesus to ask someone to actually repeat their miracle story. Because he hasn't allowed the demons to confess. There was that leper in chapter 1. Jesus said, don't tell anyone that I healed you. He didn't, and later on in this chapter, he's going to tell Jairus, don't tell anyone that I raised your daughter from the dead. Later on in chapter 7, he's not going to permit the healing of the deaf mute man to be reported either. Jesus doesn't want people telling him others about his miracles. Yet here, he makes an exception. This guy, he says, no, go tell people what God has done for you. Why is this guy different? It may have, and we can only conjecture, but it may have something to do with the predominant Gentile population of the area. The fact that they're engaging in the unkosher practice of pig farming suggests they're probably not Jews. And Gentiles probably would not have had all that theological baggage about the Messiah that the Jews did. And interestingly, most of all, this crowd doesn't really want a miracle worker. And so Jesus permits the message to be proclaimed here. He's not going to be mobbed by the crowd upon the report of this thing. The gospel is being proclaimed for all nations. And that's the implicit hint we get here. It's not just for the Jews. It's for the Gentiles also. There's a model here for how the gospel is proclaimed for all. We, who were once owned by Satan and passed out of darkness into light, shall we go from possession to proclamation? That's the thought that needs to be considered here. Finally, a third story. 2 miracle stories in one. Because of the way that they're nested inside, one is nested inside the other. Jesus heals a woman of her flow of blood, and Jesus raises the dead. He hasn't raised the dead yet in the Gospel of Mark, but here he's going to raise the daughter of Jairus. And both of these stories are linked by the fact that they both involve 12 years somehow. The woman has been bleeding for 12 years, and the daughter of Jairus is 12 years old when she dies. Let's go ahead and read this. The 2 miracle stories nested inside of each other. When Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him. So he stayed by the seashore. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up and on seeing him fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so she will get well and live." And he went off with them, and a large crowd was following him and pressing in on him. A woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought, if I just touch his garments, I will get well. Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" The disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." He allowed no one to accompany him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion and people loudly weeping and wailing. And entering in, he said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep." And they began laughing at him. And putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother, his own companions, entered the room where the child was. Taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kum," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded, and he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this. He said that something should be given her to eat. These stories are connected. The two miracles are connected together, and they should be read together rightly. They're both connected by the importance of faith. This woman is told that her faith has saved her in verse 34, and Jairus is told, "Do not fear, but have faith," verse 36, or believe, as it's translated. Both of these stories also contain Jesus making a statement that everybody around him thinks is kind of silly. For example, in verses 30 and 31, Jesus asks, "Who touched my garments?" Which is kind of a silly question to ask when you've got a mob of people pressing on you on every side. Who touched my clothes? And then the other thing is when he comes in to Jairus' house and says, "Oh, the child's not dead, she's asleep." Everybody thinks that's ridiculous and start mocking him. And in both instances, in both stories, there's an attempt to conceal the miracle. In the case of Jairus' daughter, obviously he said, he limits the witnesses and he tells them, "Don't tell anybody about it." But in the case of the woman who has been healed, we have one of the rare instances in the Gospels where somebody tries to keep Jesus' miracle a secret from him. Now, of course, you can't do that because he's Jesus and he knows everything. But still, that's kind of bizarre. So what happens here? This whole thing is precipitated. Jesus has crossed the sea again to be surrounded by crowds again. And a synagogue official named Jairus finds him and falls at his feet and begs him, "Come heal my daughter so she won't die," because evidently she's about to die. And Jesus goes with Jairus, and the crowd's pressing on him. And then this menstruous woman shows up, this woman who's had a hemorrhage for 12 years, which means she's been ceremonially unclean for 12 years, according to the law of Moses. And just to make the point, in Leviticus 15, there's a whole discussion about this in Leviticus 15. I won't read Leviticus 15 right now. The last time I taught Leviticus 15 in this church, only women showed up, and I had to explain that passage, and it was very awkward. But here, basically, she would have been ceremonially unclean. And the defilement was so potent that every single person in that crowd that she touches on her way to get to Jesus becomes unclean. The doctors have not helped stopping the bleeding. They have been really good at cashing her checks, but they haven't been very good at helping. And she hears about Jesus, and she decides, "I'm going to touch his cloak. If I could just touch his garments, I would get well." Jesus doesn't need to say magic words. He doesn't need to wave his hand. He doesn't even need to converse. I don't even need to converse with him. I just got to touch his garment. Now, to understand just what the deal is with this, know what the prophets have said about defilement. In Haggai chapter 2, in verses 10, in verse 11, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, ask now the priest for ruling. If a man carries holy meat in the fold of his garment, and touches bread with this fold, or cooked food, wine, or other food, will it become holy?" The person answered no. So he's got holy food in his garment, he touches something with the garment, nothing becomes holy. But on the other hand, verse 13, Haggai says, "If one who is unclean from a corpse touches any of these, will the latter become unclean?" And the priest answered, "It will become unclean." So if a guy who's unclean from a corpse comes and touches this priest's garment, the priest becomes unclean. The garment becomes unclean. So that's how uncleanness works. Uncleanness is contagious. Cleansing is not. Holiness is not contagious. So when this woman comes to this conclusion that, if I touch Jesus' garment, I will be made clean. How did she get there? How did she come to that idea? I doubt she learned it from the doctors, who would probably have been more than happy to keep her coming, keep paying up. The idea is a statement of faith. Because she understands something about Jesus. Jesus, who commands the unclean spirits and they obey Him, has power over defilement, has power over disease. Holiness must emanate from Him. She understands something about the Messiah, who would inscribe on the bells of the horses, as it says in Zechariah 14, the bells of the unclean horses, holy to the Lord. And upon touching His garment, her flow dries up and she is healed. And we've seen in the case of the leper, in the case of the leper from earlier, the rules don't work the same way with Jesus. They work in reverse. Touching Jesus doesn't defile him. It cleanses her. Now, of course, nobody keeps secrets from Jesus. He asks, "Who touched me?" As if He didn't know. He wants her to reveal herself, to make a point to all. The disciples see the question as silly. You go, "Jesus, who touched you? Everybody touched you." Jesus finds the woman. She confesses what she's done. She's not in trouble. Her faith has made her well. Literally, her faith has saved her. Unlike the disciples, who Jesus had to rebuke for having no trust, this woman has trust, and Jesus commends her for it. But during all the commotion, Jairus receives the unthinkable news. All the time you took to stop and question this woman, Jairus' daughter has died. And she's already dead. And in the minds of the messengers, the entire procession is now a waste of time. After all, who can raise the dead? Cleansing defilement, menstrual impurity, that's one thing. But cleansing the defilement of death, that's too tall an order. You can perform this miracle, but not that one? Well, that's not how faith in God works. Jesus turns from the woman whose faith has saved her to tell Jairus to have faith. Jesus deliberately limits the audience. He only takes Peter and James and John with Him. He kicks out all the mourners, so it's just mother and father and 3 disciples. The mourners, of course, they're weeping and wailing, and they laugh at Jesus when He says, "Well, she's not really dead, she's just asleep." Jesus doesn't perform any elaborate rituals. He says, "Talitha kum." That's not some random magic words. He's just saying, "Little girl, get up." It's Aramaic. Common language of the day. And as the storms and the demons obey, this little girl obeys. The one who commands the winds and the waves to be still can command a corpse to start moving again. The voice that stopped the wind restarts her breath. Jesus forbids telling anyone and says, "Get her something to eat." But why? Why keep resurrection from the dead a secret? Wouldn't you tell people your kid was raised from the dead? There's something to this. The miracle, in one way, the miracle is a parable for those who didn't see it. They don't get the secret explanation. Maybe, so the mourners outside, the little girl comes out, "Oh, Jesus was right. She really was just asleep." You can believe that, sure. Or you can believe the truth that she was dead, and now she isn't dead anymore. They may not have seen it firsthand, but the evidence is there to follow. But raising the dead to life foreshadows another resurrection, the power that Jesus has over all death. A day comes in the Gospel of Mark when the tomb of Jesus is found empty. They know they put the dead body in there. But they come 3 days later, there's no body in there anymore. Instead, they find the angels who say, "Oh, He's not here. He's risen. Go tell other people about it." And gripped by fear in Mark 16 and verse 8, the women initially say nothing to anyone. How opposite of all of this. How much more now do we need faith in God? Take out your songbooks as we conclude this morning. This is Jesus, the Christ who commands the storm, who commands the demons, who cleanses defilements, who raises the dead, who has Himself risen from the dead. The world can rationalize it away all they want, or they can accept the evidence of His resurrection. And which is it going to be for us? But then to think about something else. That Jesus, who demonstrates that much authority over the creation itself, over the demons themselves, the most evil things that exist, and they have to obey Him. So what does it say about us? when the Lord Jesus tells us to do a thing and we don't do it, what does it say about our level of respect to His authority? Oh, but we believe. Big deal. The demons believe and shudder. Anyone can be afraid. Anyone can believe. But obeying the voice of the Lord, that is the thing that we are exhorted to do. And if we're not in conformity with the Lord, there's a day coming when Jesus will come back to vanquish more hostile forces, to vanquish all that are hostile to Him. And you have to ask yourself the question, am I one of the forces that are hostile to God? Am I one of the people that have opposed God and resisted His authority? Or am I standing on the side of God, submissive to His will? Now, if you're here this morning and you have not submitted to the will of God, you have not been baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, or perhaps you have not been living the way that the Lord would have you to live, now is a time to make it right, to make it known. Let us do whatever we can to help you. While together we stand and we sing the song selected.